Oh yeah, so I got chapter 18. Well, that's really splendid, Dixon. Welch says 7 hours later. You filled in all the gaps in a most really quite admirable. He gloated over his notes for a moment and suddenly added, "What are you going to do now?" with an effect of suspicion. In point of fact, Dixon had got his hands behind his back now and was gesturing with them. He stammered. "I was wondering if you're doing anything this evening. I thought you might like to come over and have a meal with us." After a day of doing Welch's work, there was plenty for Dixon to do that evening in connection with his lecture. But it was obvious that he couldn't afford to turn down this offer, so he said unhesitatingly, "Well, thank you very much, Professor. That's very kind of you." Welch nodded as if pleased and gathered up the papers and pulled them into his bag. "I think this ought to go down very well tomorrow night," he said, turning to Dixon. His section, Dixon, he said, turning on Dixon, his sexual maniac smile. "I'm sure it will. Who's the talking being delivered to?" "The Antiquarian and Historical Society." "I'm surprised you haven't seen the posters." He picked up his bag and put his fawn fishing hat on his head. "Come along, then. We'll go down in my car." "That'll be nice. I must say they are a marvelously keen lot," Welch said passionately as they went downstairs. "A very good audience to talk to, attentive and keen, and plenty of questions to fire at you afterwards. Of course, you get mainly town people there, but we always get some of the better students along. Young Michi, for instance, a good lad that. Have you managed to get him interested in your special subject at all?" Reflecting that Michi was lying ominously low these days, Dixon said, "Yes, he seems quite set on it, and hoped that Welch would take due heed of this testimony to his power to interest such a good lad." Welch went on as before, "A very good lad he is, very keen, always turns up to the antiquarians. I've had one or two chats with him, as a matter of fact. I think we really got quite a lot in common." Dixon doubted whether Welch and Michi had much in common beyond a similar view of his own capacities, but judging that Welch's professional ethics would prevent him from instancing that, asked with a show of curiosity, "In what way?" "Well, we both have this interest in the English tradition, as you might call it. His is more philosophical, I suppose, and mine more what you would sum up as cultural, but we've got quite a lot in common. I was thinking the other day, by the way, that it's remarkable how my own interests have turned more and more towards this English tradition in the last few years, whereas my wife's are. I've always summed her up as Western European first and an Englishwoman second. With her, you see, with her sort of continental way of looking at things, almost Gallic, you might say she is in some things, well, the things that are so important to me. She is in some things, well, the things that are so important to me, the English social and cultural scene, with the kind of backward-looking bias in a sense, popular crafts and so on, traditional pastimes and that, well, to her that's an aspect in a way, you see, just an aspect, a very interesting aspect, of course, but no more than an aspect." And here he hesitated as if choosing the accurate term, "a sort of aspect of the development of Western European culture, you might say. You can see it most clearly, really, in her attitude towards the welfare state. It's a great advantage to be able to view that problem in a way you might describe as a wider perspective. She argues, you see, that if people have everything done for them." Dixon, having long ago summed up Mrs. Welch on his own account, allowed Welch to go on about her political views, her attitude towards so-called freedom and education, her advocacy of retributive punishment, her fondness for reading what Englishwomen wrote about how Parisians thought and felt. His own thoughts and feelings all the time they were getting into the car and driving off were busy on the subject of Margaret. He didn't know how he was to face meeting her. This reflection, which had been occupying him for most of the day at the public library, had become much more urgent now that he'd have to face meeting her very shortly. He'd also presumably have to face meeting Bertrand and Mrs. Welch, but these encounters must, in comparison, be much less appalling. That'd be Christine as well. He didn't really want to see her either, not because of anything to do with her personally, but because she formed a portion of his worry about Margaret. He had to do something to show Margaret she wasn't entirely alone. He wouldn't. He mustn't let himself get back on the old footing with her. But he must somehow reassure her of his continued support. How was he going to do that? In search of some distraction, he looked out of the window at his left, just as Welch slowed to a walking pace at a road junction. Standing on the pavement was a big fat man who Dixon recognized as his barber. Dixon felt a deep respect for this man because of his impressive exterior, his rumbling bass voice, and his unsurpassable stock of information about the royal family. At that moment, two rather pretty girls stopped at a pillar box a few yards away. His hands clasped his hands clasped behind his back, turned and stared at them. An unmistakable look of furtive lust came over his face. Then, like a courtly shopwalker, he moved slowly towards the two girls. Welch now accelerated again, and Dixon, a good deal shaken, hurriedly switched his attention to the other side of the road, where a cricket match was being played, and the bowler was just running up to bowl the bowler. The batsman, another big fat man, swiped at the ball, missed it, and was violently hit by it in the stomach. Dixon had time to see him double up, and the wicket-keeper began to run forward before a tall hedge hid the scene. Uncertain whether this part of the vignettes was designed to illustrate the swiftness of divine retribution or its tendency to mistake its target, Dixon was quite sure that he felt in some way overwhelmed, so much so that he listened to what Welch was saying. He was saying, most impressive, and for a second, Dixon felt like picking up the spanner he could... Oh no, what's it? Most impressive, and for a second, Dixon felt like picking up the spanner he could see in the dashboard pocket and hitting him on the back of the neck with it. He knew the sort of thing Welch found impressive. The rest of the journey passed uneventfully. Welch's driving seemed to have improved slightly at any rate. The only death Dixon felt himself threatened by was a death from exposure to boredom. Even this danger receded for a couple of minutes while Welch disclosed a few facts about the recent history of the effeminate writing Michelle, a character always waiting in the wings of Dixon's life, but apparently destined never to enter its stage. This Michelle, as indefatigably Gallic as his mother, had been cooking for himself in a small London flat and had in the last few days made himself ill by stuffing himself with filthy foreign food of his own preparation. In particular, Dixon gathered spaghetti and dishes cooked in olive oil. This seemed fit punishment for one so devoted to coagulated flour and water and peasant's butter substitute, washed down, no doubt, by real black coffee of high viscosity. Anyway, Michelle was evidently coming down in a day or two to recuperate on his parents' English fare. Dixon turned his head to laugh out of the window at this last stroke. This time he experienced nothing worse than a small rage at the thought of a little louse like that having a flat in London. Why hadn't he himself had a parents whose money so far exceeded their sense as to install their son in London? The very thought of it was a torment. If he'd had that chance, things would be very different for him now. For a moment he thought he couldn't think what things, then he found he could conceive the things exactly how they differed from the things he got, too. Welch went on talking, his own face, the perfect audience for his talk, laughing at his jokes, reflecting his puzzlement and earnestness, responding with tight lips and narrowed eyes to its more important points. He went on talking even while he drove up the sandy path into the yard next to his house, grazed the shattered water tap, nosed into the garage entrance, and with a single frightful bound brought the car to rest within a couple of inches of the inner wall. Then he got out. Casting about for means to leave the car, Dixon rejected the 6-inch corridor left to him between the door and the side wall nearest him, and after some bad-tempered leg play with the gear and brake levers, slid across the front seat to the other door. As he did this, something seemed to pluck at the seat of his trousers. When he emerged in the giddy heat of the garage, he felt behind him and found he could comfortably insert his first 2 fingers into a rent in the material. A glance at the driver's seat showed the tip of what must have been a broken spring just emerging from the upholstery. He began slowly to follow Welch, his heart starting to pound and mist breaking out on his spectacles. He allowed a terrible grimace to dawn on his features, forcing his chin down as far as possible and trying to bring his nose up between his eyes. When this was nearing completion, he took off his glasses to rub them clear. His sight was good enough without their aid for him to observe that 4 witnesses of his actions were posted at the long windows some yards away. They were, left to right, Christine, Bertram, Mrs. Welch, and Margaret. He quickly restored his nose to its normal position and began pensively fondling his dropped chin in the hope of seeming assailed by imbecilic doubt. Then, unable to think up any gesture or expression of greeting comprehensive enough to include all the members of such a quartet, pursued Welch's retreating figure on the corner of the house. What was he going to do about his trousers, which would be worse, mending themselves, which would involve finding, or more likely rebuying, the required materials, having them repaired at a shop, which meant remembering to ask someone where such a shop could be found, remembering to take the trousers to it, and remembering to fetch and pay for them, or asking Miss Cutler to do them. Will the last be the quickest? Yes, but it might carry with it a penalty of watching the operation and being talked to by Miss Cutler during it and for an incalculable time after it. Apart from a pair belonging to a suit much too dark for anything but interviews and funerals, his only other trousers were so stained with food and beer that they would, if worn on the stage to mitigate squalor and penury, be considered ridiculously overdone. Welch should do the repairs. It was his horrible car, wasn't it? Why hadn't he torn his own vile trousers on the barbed seat? Perhaps he would soon, or perhaps he had already without noticing. Passing under the thatched bar bed over the front door, Dixon averted his eyes from a picture Welch had recently bought and talked about and which now hung in the wall. The work of some kindergarten oaf, it recalled in its technique, the sort of drawing found in male lavatories, though its subject an assortment of barrel-bodied animals debouching from the ark. debouching, debouching from the ark, was of narrower appeal. On the other side was a high shelf with an array of copper and china utensils on it. Among them was Dixon's special toy jug, a sneering he now fixed with his eyes. and sneering he now fixed with his eyes. He hated that topi jug with its open black hat, its blurred, startled face, its spindle limbs coalesced with its torso more strenuously than any other inanimate occupant of this house, not excepting Welch's recorder. Its expression proved that it knew what he thought of it, and it could tell nobody. He put a thumb on each of his temples, waggled his head at it, rolled his eyes, mouthed jeers and imprecations. A third Welch property now manifested itself, a young ginger cat called Id. It was the only survivor of a litter of 3. The other 2 Mrs. Welch had christened Ego and Super Ego. Trying his best not to think of this, Dixon bent and tickled Id under the ear. He admired it for never allowing either of the senior Welches to pick it up. Scratch him, he whispered to it. Pee on the carpets. It began to purr loudly. As soon as Dixon had joined the company within the leisurely tempo of his day jerked abruptly into frenzy, Welch wheeled towards him. Christine, more apple-cheeked even then he remembered her, was grinning at him in the background. Mrs. Welch and Bertrand moved in the direction. Margaret turned her back. Moved in his direction. Margaret turned her back. Welch said energetically, "Oh, Faulkner." Dixon's nose twitched his glasses up. "You, Professor?" "At least," Dixon, he hesitated, then went on with unprecedented fluency. "I'm afraid that there's been a bit of a mix-up, Dixon. I've forgotten that we'd all promised to go to the theater this evening with the goldsmith. We shall have to dine early, so I shall just have time to change and freshen up and drive us into town. There'll be room for you if you want a lift. You see, I'm sorry about it, of course, but I shall have to rush off now. We must have you over another time." Before he was out of the room, Mrs. Welch moved up like an actress dead on her cue. Bertrand was at her side, rather red in the face. She said, "Oh, Mr. Dixon, I've been wondering when I should see you again. I have 1 or 2 points I want to take up with you. First of all, I'd like you to explain, if you can, just what happened to the sheet and the blankets on your bed when you were our guest here recently." While Dixon was still trying to moisten his mouth enough to speak, she added, "I'm waiting for an answer, Mr. Dixon." The Englishwoman in her seemed for the moment to have forged well ahead of the Western European. Dixon noticed that Christine and Margaret had moved down the room together, talking quietly. "I don't quite know what," he mumbled. "I didn't see. How could he have forgotten what she said over the phone on the occasion of the Beasley Evening Post impersonation? It hadn't crossed his mind once in the meantime. Am I supposed to understand that you do not have anything to do with the matter? If so, the only other possible culprit's my maid, in which case I shall have to—" "No," Dixon broke in. "I don't deny it. Please, Mrs. Welch, I'm desperately sorry about it all. I know I should have come to you and told you about it, but I'd done so much damage I was afraid to. It was silly. I hope you somehow wouldn't find out, but I really knew you would, of course. Will you send me a bill for what it costs you to replace it? Blankets as well, I mean. I must make it good. Thank God they still didn't know about the table." "Of course you must, Mr. Dixon. Before we discuss that, though, I want to hear how the damage was caused, exactly what happened, please." "I know I behaved very badly, Mrs. Welch, but don't ask me to explain that. I've apologized and promised to pay for the damage. Won't you let me keep the explanation to myself? It's nothing very terrible, I can assure you." "And why do you refuse to say what it is?" "I don't refuse. I'm only asking you to spare me a lot of embarrassment that wouldn't help you at all." Bertrand now joined in, put his shaggy face on one side. He brought it nearer, saying, We can't put up with that, Dixon. It won't hurt us to put up with your embarrassment. It'll be some kind of a small return for the way you behaved." His mother put her hand on his arm. "No, don't interfere, darling. It won't do any good. Mr. Dixon is used to being talked to like that, I'm sure. We can't leave this. It doesn't alter the main facts of the situation. I want to get on to the next thing. I'm now fairly firmly convinced, Mr. Dixon, that it was you who rang me up recently and pretended, in fact, you lied when I asked you, pretended both to myself and to my son to be a newspaper reporter. It was you, wasn't it? It'll be much better if you admit it, you know. I haven't mentioned any of this to my husband because I don't want to worry him, but I warn you that unless I get a satisfactory, like a criminal who, having begun to confess, sees no reason for not going on." Dixon was about to admit it, but remembered in time that this would incriminate Christine. How much of anything had Bertrand got out of her? "You're quite wrong there, Mrs. Welch. I can't imagine why you think any such thing. Your husband will tell you I haven't been away once this term." "Haven't been away? I don't see how that affects matters." "Well, simply that I couldn't have been here and in London at the same time, could I?" Restraining Bertrand, Mrs. Welch said in puzzlement. "What's it got to do with it? How could I have phoned through London if I was here all the time? I take it was a London call?" Bertrand looked questioningly at his mother. She shook her head and said quietly, hardly moving her mouth, "No, it was a local call, right? Whoever it was spoke right away. You always get the operator first if it's a London call." "I told you were wrong," Bertrand said peevishly. "I told you old David West was behind all this." Damn it, Christine was certain it was him on the phone to her, calling himself Atkinson. It was some pal of his who spoke to us, not. His eye fell on Dixon, and he stopped speaking. Dixon was savoring his defensive triumph. He'd remembered the advantages of pretending misunderstanding in this situation, and it was now clear, too, that Bertrand had got nothing out of Christine. "Has that cleared things up at all?" he asked the others politely. Mrs. Welch began to go red again. "I think I'll just go and see how your father's getting on, darling," she said. "There are 1 or 2 things I want him to—" Leaving the sentence in the air, she went out. Bertrand moved the place closer. Well, forget all about that business, he said generously. Now, I've been wanting us to have a little get-together for quite some time, old boy. Ever since that ball affair, in fact. Now, look here, here's a question for you, and I don't mind telling you, I mean to get a straight answer. What precisely was your game the other evening when you induced Christine to skip out of the dance with you? A straight answer, mind. This must all have been clearly audible to Christine, who now came down the room with Margaret. Both girls avoided Dixon's eyes while they went out, leaving them alone with Bertrand. When the door was shut, Dixon said, I can't give any sort of answer, straight or crooked, to a meaningless question. What do you mean? What was my game? I wasn't playing any sort of game. You know what I mean as well as I do. What were you up to? You better ask Christine that. We'll leave her out of this if you don't mind. Why should I mind? Dixon, in spite of the thought of how Mrs. Welch Bill will gobble up in his bank balance, suddenly began to exult. The preliminary maneuverings, the cold war between himself and Bertrand were at least. This was a whiff of grape shot. Don't be funny, Dixon. Just tell me what was going on, will you? Or shall I have to try something a little more forcible? Don't you be funny either. What do you want to know? Bertrand clenched his fist. Then, when Dixon took off his glasses and squared his shoulders, unclenched it again, Dixon put his glasses back on. I want to know, Bertrand said, then hesitated. What my game was? We've been into that. Shut up. What did you intend doing with Christine? That's what I want to know. I intended doing exactly what I did. I intended to go away from that place with Christine and bring her back here in a taxi and finally return to my digs in the same taxi. That's what I did do. I'm not having that, do you understand? It's too late not to have it. You've had it already. Now just you get straight in your head, Dixon. I've had enough of your merry little quips. Christine is my girl and she stays my girl. Got, ma'am? If you mean, do I follow your line of thought? I do. That's splendid. Well, if I find you playing this sort of trick again, or any sort of bloody clever trick, I'll break your horrible neck for you and get you dismissed from your job as well, understand? Yes, I understand, all right, but you're wrong if you think I'll let you break my neck for me. And if you think they chuck people out of academic jobs for taking their professor's son's girlfriends home in taxis, then you're even more wrong, if possible. Bertrand's reply reassured Dixon that Bertrand hadn't so far found out from his father about Dixon's present standing in the eyes of college authority. The reply was, don't think you can defy me and get away with it, Dixon. People never do. People are beginning to, Welch. You must realize that it's up to Christine whether she sees any more of me. If you feel you must threaten someone, go and threaten her. Bertrand's son suddenly yelled out in a near falsetto bay, I've had about enough of you, you little bastard. I won't stand any more of it, do you hear? To think of a lousy little Philistine like you coming and monkeying about in my affairs, it's enough to get out and stay out before you get hurt. Leave my girl alone. You're wasting your time. You're wasting her time. You're wasting my time. What the hell do you mean by buggering about like this? You're big enough and old enough and ugly enough to know better. Dixon was saved from replying by the sudden re-entry of Christine and Margaret. The scene broke up. Christine, who seemed to be trying to flash Dixon a message he couldn't read, took Bertrand by the arm and led him, still loudly protesting, out of the room. Margaret silently offered Dixon a cigarette, which he took. Neither spoke while they sat down side by side on the couch, nor for some moments afterwards. Dixon found himself trembling a good deal. He looked at Margaret, and an intolerable weight fell upon him. He knew now what he'd been trying to conceal from himself ever since the previous morning. What the role with Bertrand had made him temporarily disbelieve. He and Christine would not, after all, be able to eat tea together the following afternoon. If he was going to eat that meal with any female apart from Miss Culler, it would be not Christine, but Margaret. He remembered a character in a modern novel Beasley had lent him who was always feeling pity moving in him like sickness or some such jargon. The parallel was apt. He felt very ill. That was about the dance business, wasn't it? Margaret asked. Yes, he seemed to resent it all rather. I'm not surprised. What was he shouting? He was trying to persuade me to keep off the grass. As far as she's concerned, that's right. Are you going to? Are you going to keep off the grass? Yes. Why, James? Because of you. He'd been expecting a demonstration of some strong feeling or other here, but she only said, I think that's rather silly of you, in a neutral tone that wasn't ostentatiously neutral, but simply neutral. What makes you say that? I thought we got all settled yesterday. I don't see the point of starting the whole thing over again. It can't be helped. We'd have started it again sometime. It might just as well be now. Don't be ridiculous. You'd have much more fun with her than you ever had with me. That's as may be. The point is that I've got to stick to you. He said this without bitterness, nor did he feel any. There was a short silence before she replied, I don't hold with these renunciations. You're throwing her away for a scruple? That's the action of a fool. This time a minute or more went by before either spoke. Dixon felt that his role in this conversation, as indeed in the whole of his relations with Margaret, had been directed by something outside himself and yet not directly present in her. He felt more than ever before that what he said and did arose not out of any willing on his part, nor even out of boredom, but out of a kind of sense of situation. And where did that sense come from? As if seeing, he took no share in willing it. With disquiet, he found that words were forming in his mind, words which, because he could think of no others, he'd very soon hear himself uttering. He got up, thinking that he might go to the window and somehow derive alternative speech from what he saw out of it, but before reaching it, he turned and said, "It isn't a matter of scruples, it's a matter of seeing what you've got to do." She said clearly, "You're faking this up because you're frightened of me." He looked at her closely for the first time since she'd come back into the room. She was sitting there with her feet drawn up on a couch and her arms around her knees. Her expression was one of intentness. She might have been discussing some academic point on which she was both informed and interested. He noticed that she was wearing much less makeup than usual. "Not after yesterday," he said. Again, he wasn't conscious of having decided what to say. "I don't know what you mean. Never mind. Stop objecting like this. The whole thing's perfectly straightforward." Not as far as I'm concerned, James. I can't understand you at all." "Yes, you can." He went on and sat beside her again. Let's go to the pictures tonight. You can get out of theater. You can get out of the theater. Kara won't mind, I know. Let's go to the pictures tonight. You can get out of okay. I wasn't going anyway. That's all right then. He reached out and took her hand. She made no movement. There was another pause, during which they heard someone running heavily down into the hall. Margaret glanced at him for a moment, then turned her head away. In a parted sort of voice, she said, "All right, I'll come to the pictures." "Good." Dixon felt glad it was over. "I'll go and find Nettie and book a seat in the car. You can get 6 in, all right. You go up and get ready." They went out into the hall where Welch, now wearing a blue serge suit of startlingly extravagant cut, was to be seen admiring his picture. When Margaret said, "I shan't be a minute," and went up the stairs, Dixon reflected that their conversation, whatever its other peculiarities, had reflected an honesty on both sides that their relations had never shown before. There was something anyway, or that was something anyway. Welch's mouth opened at his approach, no doubt in preparation for some pronouncement beginning. The point about child art, of course, but Dixon got in first by explaining that Margaret would also, if convenient, like a seat in the car. After a very brief visitation from his wondering frown, Welch nodded and walked with Dixon to the front door, which he opened. They went on to the step. A light breeze was blowing, and the sun shone through a thin tissue of cloud. The heat had gone out of the day. "I'll just go and bring the car around," Welch said. "I quite forgotten we were going out, you see, or I wouldn't have garaged it. I shan't be a minute." He went off. As he did so, somebody else's steps could be heard on the stairs. Dixon turned around and saw Christine coming towards him wearing a little black bolero, but otherwise dressed exactly as he'd seen her on the arty weekend. Perhaps these were the only ordinary clothes she had, in which case he oughtn't to have let her give him the £1 for the taxi. She smiled at him and joined him on the step. "I hope you didn't have too bad of a time with Bertrand," she said. "Bertrand? Oh no, it was all right. I managed to calm him down after a bit." He watched her. She stood with her legs apart and looked very sturdy and confident. The breeze blew a small lock of fair hair the wrong way, half across the party, and she screwed up her eyes slightly as she faced the sun. It was as if she were about to do something dangerous, important, and simple, which she knew she could have a credible shot at, whether she succeeded or not. A feeling of grief that was also a feeling of exasperation settled upon Dixon. He looked away over the fields beyond the nearby hedge to where a line of osiers marked the bed of a small stream. A crowd of rooks, perhaps a couple of 100, flew towards the house, then, directly above the stream, swerved aside along its course. "About this tea tomorrow," Dixon said, half turning back to Christine. "Yes," she said, looking a little nervous. "What about?" As she said this, Welch started up his car at the side of the house. She added, "You needn't worry. I'll be there all right." Before he could reply, she glanced over her shoulder into the hall and took her finger at him, frowning. Bertrand came out on the step, glancing from one of them to the other. He was wearing a blue beret, which had much the same effect on Dixon as Welch's senior fishing hat. If such headgear was a protection, what was it a protection against? If it wasn't a protection, what was it? What was it for? What was it for? As if divining what he wanted to ask, Christine again frowned at him, then at Bertrand. "Now, whatever you two think of each other," she said, "for goodness sake, pull yourselves together, both of you, and behave decently in front of Mrs. and Mrs. Welch. I thought you both gone off your heads just now." "I was only telling him where he," Bertrand began. "Well, you're not going to tell him anything now," she turned to Dixon. "You're not going to tell him anything. If you start quarreling in the car, I'll jump out." They stood apart from each other for a few minutes while Dixon's regret concentrated on the fact that to abandon the pursuit of Christine meant opposing a ceasefire in Bertrand's campaign. Then Welch's car, with its owner at the wheel, came bouncing round the corner, and the three of them moved towards it. Mrs. Welch, accompanied by Margaret, came out of the house, shut the front door, and joined them. Not looking at Dixon, a rather undignified scramble for places now ensued, ending with Dixon in occupation of the middle of the triple front seat, with Margaret on his left. Behind sat Mrs. Welch, Christine, and Bertrand. Dixon thought the arrangement prettily symmetrical. Breathing noisily, Welch snatched his foot off the clutch pedal, and in the kangaroo mode to which it must by now be accustomed, the car started on its journey. Okay. Hair needs to go down, baby. Yeah, I don't really grow hair. My hair. Yeah, that was chapter 19, yo. That was that was chapter 18. I'm on chapter 19 now, so I just finished chapter 18. 25-minute chapter, man. I'm trying to finish this book before I go to the library. So I have another 60 pages, so I gotta keep going.